everybody, this tutorial will go over how to set up some different types of render layers in Maya. We'll go over how to create separate character and environment layers as well as RGB mattes and cast shadows, and then talk a little bit about how to render those layers out and composite them in After Effects. So right now I have Maya 2018 open. And I'll link this folder to the video description so you can download it. I have this render layers demo folder, and in there's a render layers demo Maya file as well as an images folder. Before I open that up, I want to set the project so that the textures will come in correctly. So I'll go to File, Set Project. In the Set Project window, I want to browse to my desktop and then find that render layers demo folder. Double click on that. And I want to set the project to that folder. And then I want to go to File, Open Scene, and open up the Render Layers Demo 001. So this is an animation that I downloaded from Mixamo.com, and it's inside this lighthouse setting that some of you are probably familiar with. I have two cameras set up, so I can go to the render cam to see the wider shot. And then there's another camera called Render Cam CU where I can see this character that I have. This is actually animated, so if I hit play in the timeline, I can see what that looks like. Just getting some exercise in the morning outside the lighthouse. So I'm going to go ahead and stop that. And the first thing I want to do is a test render from the wide camera. So I'll go back to the render cam, set my workspace to the rendering expert. And if it doesn't look like this, you can always go to Reset Rendering Expert to Factory Default, and then that shows all of the stuff that you need. And I want to get my Arnold render view and make sure that that's docked right next to the regular render view. And I'll go ahead and do a test render here. And make sure this is set to render cam. So I want to start to split this up. I'll go over to my Render Setup tab on the left and create a new layer. And I'll go ahead and stop the interactive render while I'm doing that. I'm going to call this env_all. And I want to add all the pieces of the environment to this. So I'm going to right-click, Create Collection, name that env. You see this property editor down below? That tells you everything that's in that environment collection. And there's some buttons that you need to see that are over to the right. So if you don't see it exactly like this, scroll over to the side and you'll see these buttons that say Add, Select, and Remove. And I want to select whatever I want to put in this layer first. So I've got the ENV master selected. And if I go back to my view panes, I can see that it selected everything there. And I'm going to go to Select Hierarchy. And what that does is it selects every individual shape that's in here, and that'll become important later. So go ahead and hit the Add button, and you'll see that everything gets listed there. And I'm going to change this filters drop down to all. And then I'm set with that. So if I click on the eyeball right next to that render layer, then I can go into the Arnold render view and render from just that layer. I'm going to go over to the Arnold render view and go to Render and do an Update Full Scene. Because Maya is a little bit finicky about updating, sometimes even if you render in here, it might not pick up your changes that you put in the render setup. So I always recommend, after doing a change, doing an update full scene. And as you can see now, you have the environment, but the character is no longer there. Because I want this background to interact with the character still, I want to make sure that the shadow gets added on there. So I'm going to go ahead and add the character to a separate collection. Create collection, grandma, that's the character there. And I'll select rig grandma, do a select hierarchy, scroll over and hit add, and change this to shapes. And now the character is in there, but I only want the shadow. So what I have to do is change the render settings just on this collection and just in this layer. So to create an override, I want to make sure that the eyeball is on the layer, and then I right click and do a create absolute override, which is the second from the bottom. And that'll let you override any attribute. And it gets it based on the attribute name. It actually doesn't matter where you find the attribute from. All that matters is what's in here. So I'm going to go select any geometry in the scene and then go into the Shape tab and Render Stats. And the attribute I want here is the primary visibility. So I'm going to click on primary visibility over here, middle mouse drag, and put it into the absolute override. And you can see it gets displayed there. And I want it to be off. So now when I go back to the render, you can see just the character's shadow is there, but the character no longer is. Okay, so now if I want to create a character render layer, I want to do the opposite of what I have set up for the environment. So first of all, I'm going to copy this by doing a Control C, Control V, and I want to name this car grandma. And for this layer, I want the override to be on the environment, not the grandma collection. So I'm going to drag that over to environment and then hit render over here. Before I do that, I want to make sure that the eyeball is on car grandma. And that's just the character by herself. One thing I can take advantage of here is that the camera for this scene is not moving. It's just a still background. So there isn't really any reason to render the full background, except for the fact that the character's shadows are on the ground. If we can split off that shadow into a separate render layer, then we could do an optimization and just render out one frame of the environment. So what I'm going to do now is copy the environment all render layer again. So Control C, Control V, and then name that cast shad. So now that I have the copy of the cast shad layer, I want to apply a different shader to the environment. So I'm going to right click on this and do create material override. Once I add the override, you'll see that there's an override material with a checkerboard next to it. And I'll click on that and I'll go into Arnold shaders. And the shader that I want here is the AI shadow matte. It looks kind of like a plain gray in the viewer. And making sure that eye is selected, now I can go into the Arnold render view and hit render. And as you'll see, it looks like it rendered completely black, but there is something happening behind the scenes. So if I go into this button that says RGB and then make sure I'm viewing the alpha, I can see that this is all of the cast shadows in the scene. So that's pretty useful. So you see the character is kind of small here, but there's also shadows from the fence onto the ground and the cliff shadowing onto itself. For our purposes, we want just the character, so we'll have to add one more override here because we don't want the environment to be casting shadows onto itself here. So I'll go right click and create a absolute override. And now again, I can pick any shape in here and go into the render stats area. And the property I want here now is the cast shadows. So I'll middle mouse click on that and drag it over and make sure it is unchecked here. So now I've got just the shadow of that character, and that's in the alpha channel. So before I forget, I'm going to change this back so it displays the RGB. So just remember with the cast shadow layer, even if it looks black, it might be okay. You have to check the alpha channel. So now that I've done that, I can actually get rid of the grandma collection inside the ENVL layer because I want that without shadows. So I'm going to do a quick test render there. Okay, so now I have a render of just the ENV all layer, and I'm going to select the grandma layer and the cast shadow, which will be black. Okay, sometimes in production, it is useful to be able to isolate different parts of the environment. So the next thing I'd like to do is set up a layer called an RGB matte. So I'll go ahead and create a new layer, call it RGB underscore matte. Say I want to have some control over this lighthouse by itself. I can select it in the outliner, and I'll go to the RGB matte, right click, create collection, name that lighthouse. And in the outliner with that lighthouse selected, I'll go to select hierarchy, add it in the property editor, change the filter to shapes. And I want to apply a material override to it. I'll go into Arnold Shader, and this time I want to create an AI utility. And this has a few different shading modes that you can apply as overrides. For this particular case, I want to change the shade mode to flat and the color to red. I'll name it matte red. And I want to put the eyeball on the RGB matte layer, go into Arnold Render View, and hit the play button. It should have only shown the lighthouse, and that's probably because the scene wasn't updated, so I'll go to Render, Update Full Scene. So now I have a flat red version of that lighthouse. And I want to create other parts of the environment in here too, so I'll go and right-click on RGB matte again, create collection, and now I want to isolate the house that's in the scene, so I'll name this house. With the house collection selected, I'll go select the house in the outliner, select hierarchy, add, change this to all, and now do another material override. Create a AI utility shader and change this to flat, and this time I'm going to pick green as the color and name it matte green. And now I want to select everything that's part of the ground plane and make that another part of the matte. So I'll create another collection, call that ground. And for this one, I'm going to go into the ENV master and select the island because that'll be almost everything that's part of the environment except the house. So if I go back to the scene layer with the eyeball, I can see what that actually is. One thing when you're viewing from a render layer, it'll only show you the contents of the collections that you already have in there. And because I don't have anything other than these two pieces, then I can't see them when I'm in this layer. It's kind of like display layers. So I have that island selected, do select hierarchy and add, and create another material override. Go into shader, AI utility, change it to flat, and this time the color will be blue, and name that matte blue. So now I can try rendering that. So now I have a nice color matte. The only thing that's missing right now is the fence and the sign that was in front. I don't want to assign those to any of these three colors, so I'm going to add those as a cutout, which is also sometimes known as a matte, and that'll be a different kind of override. So I'll create a collection here and call it fence. Then I'll select the signs and the fence. Select hierarchy, add all. For the fence, I want to import a user template, and the override is called mat override Arnold. And just to see what that's doing, it adds another collection that's kind of like a filter, and then at the bottom, it adds an absolute override for the AI enable map property. And if I play, then I'll see what that does. So basically, it punches the fence out of the objects. And if you want to see really what it's doing, it's not just a black color, it's actually cutting it out of the alpha channel. So you can see in the alpha, this part is, the fence is actually transparent and the rest of it is opaque. And that can be useful for a number of reasons. So I'll go back and see the RGB view. Oh, and if at any time you do see there's a red outline on one of the eyeballs, that just means that layer hasn't been updated yet. So you can click on it again and that'll update. So now I've got 4 render layers. There's the ENV all, which is just the environment, the grandma character, and the cast shadow, and both of those are animated. Finally, there's the RGB matte, which is also just the environment and doesn't include the character. As you're working, you can create any combination of these layers or split it up even more. But typically, this is a pretty good setup, which will give you a lot of flexibility. So I'm going to go back to my view panes and go back to the scene layer because there's some global render settings that I want to change now. One thing that'll be useful for us to have in the composite is a way to control each light individually. So I've done a test render here from the scene render layer. There's only 2 lights in the scene. There's a sunlight and a sky dome, and I want to be able to isolate them. So if I select the sun shape, I want to go into the shape node, and in the Arnold section, if I scroll down, there's an attribute called AOV light group, and I want to give this a unique name. I'll just call it sun because that's easy. And then if I select the sky light, I'll stop the render. I don't need to have that going. For the sky shape, I'll go down to the AOV light group and type in sky in all lowercase. Now I want to go into my render settings. I'm going to actually close this property editor so I can make that a little bigger. In the render settings, I want to go into the AOVs tab and add custom. When setting up light AOVs, the naming is very important so it picks up the right lights. So I want to do all caps RGBA underscore sun. And this name has to be the same thing that I put in as the light name. If you have longer names, make sure to write them down or you can copy and paste them. And I'm going to add another custom AOV and name that RGBA underscore sky. And now both of those should be enabled, so I can hit play. And if I go into the drop down to the left, now I can see both of those AOVs in there. I'll start with the sun. And now you can see that's only the impact of the sunlight on the scene. And if I go to sky, it's only the sky. And because I set them up at this top render layer, that means I'll get those AOVs for every single layer that's underneath here. So now I want to go into the common render settings and set the frame range. There's 60 frames in this timeline, so I'll set the end frame to 60. Because the environment layers are separate, I want to change the name a little bit to remind myself that these layers are not animated. So any layer that's not animated could be named static, as it means that there's a static camera. So I'll name this ENV all static and RGB matte static. And I'm going to put the eyeball on the ENV all static layer to view it. For this layer, I'm going to right click and say create absolute override for visible layer, and you can see the text turns orange. And in here, you can specify a different end frame, and in this case, it'll be 1 because I just want 1 frame. And I want to also do that for RGB matte static. So I put the viewer there, and on end frame, I'm creating an absolute override. And that'll be here. And make sure that's set to 1. A couple last things I want to show using the close-up camera are how you can add motion blur and depth of field to your render. So I'm going to try the render cam CU now and go back to the top level scene layer. Do a test render and make sure cam CU shape is selected. And I want to make sure I have the beauty AOV selected as well. Now, if I want to add depth of field, that's an attribute that's attached to the camera. So if I go into View, select Camera, and in the Attribute Editor, go into the camera shape, and you'll see in this list of sections, there is a depth of field, but I'm going to ignore that because this depth of field won't have any effect on Arnold renders. So I want to actually go into the Arnold section and see there's a few camera attributes, and if I do enable depth of field here, you'll see that the back edge of this cliff will get a little blurry when it renders again. Now, the focus distance tells you where everything is going to be sharp, and with it set to 600, you can see that the character is pretty well in focus, but the background is pretty blurry. And I can also change the aperture size in here, so I'll try changing this to 100, which makes it very blurry in the foreground, and 400. And then I can also change the aperture size, and that makes the blur a bit more subtle if I make it lower. And you can see as the depth of field increases, the edges in the background are a little noisy. And to compensate for that, I would have to also go back into my render settings, Arnold renderer, and increase the camera AA samples. If I set that to 4, it'll look a little bit better. Just remember to do that if you are adding a lot of depth of field. Now, I'm going to go back and turn off depth of field now. So in the render settings, if you go into the Arnold renderer tab, there's a motion blur section, and you can just hit enable. As this renders, you'll see that her arms are a little bit blurred because they're moving at this point. So as you're working, it's usually best to keep the motion blur and depth of field off, and right before you're doing your final renders, you'll want to turn these back on. Okay, so now that I'm ready to start rendering, I want to do a double check of all my render settings. Make sure the name is set to name number extension, and the path at the top is what you have your project set to, so that'll tell you where to find your images later on. The frame range 1 to 60, and under renderable cameras, I want to set this to render cam. We have the preset set to HD 540, which is fine for this test, but if you are doing any final renders for a project, make sure that's set to HD 1080, but I'll keep it at 540 for now. I want to go into the AOVs and add a few more. I'll have the Z, albedo, and I'll just do diffuse, indirect, and specular. I don't want to overdo it because we won't need all of these for these demo necessarily, but those are some important ones to have. And then making sure that the slate icon is off on the scene layer but is on all the others. That'll mean that it'll render. And then I want to go to render sequence and make sure that your camera is set to render cam. And also, since I only had that one renderable camera set, I'm gonna say all render enabled cameras and just make sure those two are checked, and then I'll do render sequence. That's going to take a little while because it's going to be rendering all of the frames from all the layers, so you can go get a coffee or something and then come back when these are ready. I'm back now, and all of my renders have completed in Maya, so now I'm looking at the folder where everything got output. Looking at this, there's the 4 folders from the render layers that I created, and if I go up to the toolbar and I see the date modified and the date created, I see that the first folder was created at 8:20 p.m. and the last folder was last modified at 8:45 p.m. So if I do a 45 minus 20, that tells me All of these took about 25 minutes to render. This completes part 1, which is rendering from Maya, and then part 2 will cover how to composite all these layers in After Effects. You can go ahead and close Maya and then move on to part 2.